forest stretched endlessly before them, a tapestry of shadows and light painted by the late afternoon sun. Leah and Andrew had been walking for hours, their boots crunching over dry leaves and soft moss, the occasional bird call punctuating the quiet. The weight of the world seemed to fall away with each step deeper into the woods, but the air between them remained tense, filled with unspoken words and the remnants of their last argument. They had come here for an escape, to reconnect in a way that their bustling lives in the city no longer allowed. But the silence between them now felt less like peace and more like distance. Leah tugged her scarf tighter around her neck, the cool breeze sending a shiver through her. "Do you think we're lost?" she asked, breaking the quiet. Andrew, a few steps ahead, glanced back at her with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're not lost," he said, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. He held up the map he had insisted on bringing, its edges crinkled and worn. "The trail should loop back around. We just need to keep going." Leah nodded but didn't respond, her gaze drifting to the dense trees surrounding them. The forest felt alive in a way she hadn't expected, its stillness almost humming with an energy she couldn't name. It made her uneasy and intrigued all at once, like stepping into a storybook where the rules of the world were different, where anything could happen. As they crested a small hill, Andrew suddenly stopped, his hand raised in a silent gesture for her to pause. "What is it?" Leah whispered, stepping up beside him. He pointed ahead, and she followed his gaze. Nestled in a small clearing, partially obscured by climbing ivy and wild bushes, was a cabin. It looked ancient, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of decades. A crooked chimney jutted out from one side, and the remnants of a stone path led to the front door, which hung ajar as though inviting them in. "Wow," Leah murmured, her breath catching. "What's a place like this doing all the way out here?" Andrew frowned, his brow furrowing. "I don't know. It doesn't look like anyone's lived here in years." Curiosity tugged at Leah, and before Andrew could say anything, she stepped forward, her boots crunching on the overgrown path. The air around the cabin felt different, thicker, heavier, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Andrew followed close behind, his hand brushing her arm as if to keep her from going too far. "Leah," he said cautiously, his voice low. "Maybe we shouldn't." "It's fine," she interrupted, her tone more certain than she felt. "Look at it. It's just an old cabin. No one's here." As they approached, the scent of damp wood and earth filled the air, mingling with something subtler, something almost animalistic. Leah reached out to touch the door, her fingers brushing the rough wood, and pushed it open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing into the stillness. Inside, the cabin was dim, the light from the open door casting long shadows across the floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, and the faint smell of decay lingered, though it wasn't overpowering. The space was small, with a single room that held a crumbling fireplace, a warped table, and a few scattered chairs. On one wall, shelves sagged under the weight of dusty jars and rusted tools, and in the far corner, a bed frame sat, its mattress long gone. "It's beautiful in a way," Leah said softly, stepping inside. Andrew hesitated at the threshold, his unease clear. "Beautiful isn't the word I'd use. Creepy, maybe." Leah shot him a look over her shoulder. "Come on, don't you feel it? There's something about this place." "I feel like we shouldn't be here," Andrew muttered, but he stepped inside anyway, his movements cautious. Leah moved deeper into the cabin, her fingers trailing along the edge of the table, brushing against the grooves worn into the wood. She could almost imagine the life that had once filled this space, the crackle of the fireplace, the voices of its inhabitants. It was haunting, but it wasn't unpleasant. It felt alive. And then she heard it. A soft rustle, like the shifting of leaves or the faintest whisper of movement. Leah froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew turned sharply, his eyes scanning the room. "Hear what?" Another sound, this time a low, almost imperceptible whine, came from outside. Leah moved toward the door, her pulse quickening. "Wait," Andrew called, but she didn't stop. Stepping back onto the porch, Leah's breath caught in her throat. Standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees, were 20 dogs. They were of all shapes and sizes, large and small, sleek and shaggy, their coats a kaleidoscope of colors. But it wasn't their appearance that stopped her in her tracks. It was their eyes. Each pair seemed to glow faintly in the fading light, not in an unnatural way, but with an intelligence that was undeniable. They watched her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine, yet it wasn't fear she felt. It was something deeper, something she couldn't name. Andrew stepped out behind her, and she heard a sharp intake of breath. "What the hell?" The dogs didn't move, their gazes unwavering. One, a massive black dog with a thick, glossy coat, stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Leah's hand went to her chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt as her heart pounded. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice trembling. "They're not going to hurt us." Andrew stared at her, his expression incredulous. "You don't know that." But Leah couldn't look away from the black dog. It stopped a few feet from her, its eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. The connection was electric, almost tangible, as though the dog could see through her, past her skin and bones and into the very core of who she was. Slowly, hesitantly, she extended a hand. The dog tilted its head, studying her before stepping closer and pressing its nose against her palm. The warmth of its breath sent a jolt through her, and she let out a soft, trembling laugh. "They're amazing," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Andrew didn't move, his eyes darting between the dogs and Leah. "Leah, we should leave, now." She shook her head, her gaze still on the black dog. "No, they're not dangerous. Look at them." The other dogs began to move then, stepping into the clearing one by one. They surrounded the cabin, their movements graceful and fluid, their eyes never leaving Leah. She felt her chest tighten, but it wasn't fear, it was awe, a deep, overwhelming sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Andrew reached for her arm, his grip firm. "Leah, listen to me. This isn't normal. We need to go." She turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "There's something special about them. I can feel it." Andrew's jaw tightened, his frustration evident, but he didn't argue. He dropped his hand and stepped back, his gaze flicking to the dogs as they watched in silence. Leah turned back to the black dog, her hand still resting on its head, and smiled. "I think we're meant to be here," she said softly, more to herself than to Andrew. The black dog let out a low, rumbling sound, almost like a purr, and Leah felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The forest, the cabin, the dogs, it all felt like a puzzle she hadn't realized she was trying to solve. And now, standing there surrounded by them, she felt like she had found the missing piece. The days following the discovery of the cabin and the dogs passed in a strange, dreamlike blur for Leah. She found herself drawn to the clearing every morning, waking with an eagerness that surprised even her. The 20 dogs were always there, waiting in the same serene silence that had greeted her that first day. They didn't bark or whine or demand her attention in the way ordinary dogs might. Instead, they simply existed, their presence a quiet, powerful force that seemed to anchor her to the world in a way she had never experienced before. Andrew, on the other hand, grew increasingly uneasy. He tried to stay by her side at first, standing a few paces back as Leah crouched in the clearing, letting the dogs press against her, their warm bodies a comforting weight. But his discomfort was palpable, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his eyes darting nervously between the trees and the animals. He never said it outright, but she could feel his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "I don't understand what you see in them," he said one evening as they sat in the cabin, the fire crackling between them. His voice was tight, edged with a weariness that made Leah's chest tighten. "They're just dogs, Leah. Strange, sure, but still just dogs." Leah looked at him, her fingers wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. "They're not just dogs," she said softly. "There's something about them. Something. Different." Andrew shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Different how?" "They don't talk, they don't perform miracles, they just stare." She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the window, where the forest loomed like a dark ocean. "It's not something I can explain. It's just something I feel." Andrew's sigh was heavy, almost resigned. He leaned back in his chair, his hands rubbing over his face. "I wish you'd spend half as much time talking to me as you do with them." Her heart clenched at his words, but she didn't respond. What could she say? She loved Andrew, she did, but the connection she felt with the dogs was something else entirely. It wasn't something she could quantify or compare. It simply was. The next morning, Leah slipped out of bed before the sun rose, leaving Andrew still tangled in the blankets. The cabin felt colder without him awake, the silence sharper. She stepped outside, the air biting against her skin, and made her way to the clearing. They were waiting for her. The black dog, the one she had started calling Shadow in her mind, was the first to approach, his amber eyes glinting in the soft light of dawn. He pressed his massive head against her palm, and she smiled, her fingers tangling in his thick fur. One by one, the others came forward, their movements slow and deliberate, like shadows stretching in the morning sun. A golden retriever with a lopsided ear, Sunny. A sleek, gray wolfhound with piercing blue eyes, Mist. She had begun naming them all, the names coming to her as naturally as breathing. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice breaking the stillness. Miss me. Shadow let out a low, rumbling sound that might have been a growl but felt more like a purr. Leah laughed softly, kneeling in the grass as the dogs surrounded her. They pressed close, their warmth a welcome contrast to the chilly air. She let her hands move over them, stroking their fur, her fingers memorizing the textures and patterns that made each of them unique. Time lost meaning in the clearing. She didn't think about the life she had left behind, the city with its endless noise and demands. She didn't think about Andrew, who had started watching her with an intensity that felt more like accusation than concern. All she thought about was the dogs, their presence, their quiet understanding. It was as if they could see straight into her soul, peeling back the layer she had spent years building up. Shadow stepped closer, his massive frame blocking her view of the others for a moment. His eyes met hers, and she felt a shiver run through her, not fear, but something deeper, something that left her breathless. It was as if he were trying to tell her something, though no words were exchanged. She reached for him, her fingers brushing against his muzzle, and he leaned into her touch, his weight grounding her. They get to you, don't they? Andrew's voice cut through the moment like a sharp wind. Leah flinched, turning to see him standing at the edge of the clearing, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. She stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees. I didn't know you were awake. I couldn't sleep, he said, stepping closer. His eyes flicked to the dogs, who had shifted subtly, their attention now focused on him. I thought maybe we could spend the morning together. Just the two of us. Leah hesitated, guilt twisting in her chest. Andrew, I can't leave them. They're dogs. Leah, he said, his voice rising slightly. They'll still be here tomorrow, or the day after that. What about me? What about us? His words stung, but she couldn't make herself move toward him. Shadow nudged her hand with his nose, as if sensing her turmoil, and she glanced down at him. It's not about choosing them over you, she said quietly. It's about... I don't know how to explain it. I feel like I belong here. And I don't, Andrew asked, his tone sharp. She looked at him, her heart aching at the hurt in his eyes. You don't feel it, she asked, almost pleading. The connection. He laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. No, Leah, I don't feel whatever it is you're feeling. All I see are 20 stray dogs and the woman I love slipping away. Her breath caught, and she opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Andrew shook his head, stepping back. I'll be at the cabin, he said, his voice tight. If you decide you want to talk. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the clearing, the dogs surrounding her like silent sentinels. Shadow pressed closer, his presence a comfort she didn't deserve. She sank back to her knees, her fingers trembling as they buried themselves in his fur. I don't know what to do, she whispered, her voice cracking. Shadow's only response was a soft, steady breath, his warmth chasing away the cold that had settled in her chest. Leah closed her eyes, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She didn't know how to reconcile the two parts of her heart, the part that still loved Andrew and the part that was being pulled, inexorably, toward the dogs. All she knew was that the forest felt more like home with every passing day, and the longer she stayed in the clearing, the harder it became to leave. The cabin felt colder now, its once cozy interior heavy with the weight of silence. Andrew sat at the rickety table, his fingers drumming against the wood as he stared at the untouched plate of food in front of him. The faint glow of the fire and the hearth illuminated the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, but his eyes remained fixed on the door. He hadn't seen Leah since she'd left that morning, her footsteps fading into the forest as she made her way to the clearing. Again. It had become a pattern one Andrew couldn't ignore, no matter how much he tried to reason it away. Each day, Leah spent more time with the dogs, returning to the cabin only when the sky was painted with the deep hues of twilight. When she did return, her presence felt distant, as if she were still tethered to the forest, to them. Her smiles were fleeting, her words scarce, and the warmth they once shared seemed to dissipate more with every passing moment. The door creaked open, and Leah stepped inside, brushing a few stray leaves from her jacket. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her hair slightly mussed, and for a brief second, Andrew felt his heart twist at the sight of her. She looked so alive, so radiant, but that radiance didn't seem to belong to him anymore. You're late, he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Leah froze, her hand lingering on the doorknob as she turned to face him. I didn't realize there was a schedule, she replied, her tone cool but not unkind. Andrew exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. It's not about schedules, Leah. It's about the fact that you're gone all day, every day. We came here to spend time together, remember? I remember, she said softly, stepping further into the room. But Andrew, this place. Those dogs, they're important to me. More important than us, the question escaped before he could stop it, and he immediately regretted the raw vulnerability in his voice. Leah's eyes softened, but she didn't move closer. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "It's not about choosing one over the other." "Isn't it?" Andrew stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. "Because that's what it feels like, Leah. It feels like every day you're choosing them. And I'm just here." Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Andrew ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room in an effort to contain the frustration boiling inside him. "I don't get it," he said finally, his voice tight. "I don't get what they give you that I can't." Leah's gaze dropped to the floor, her arms wrapping around herself as if to shield against his words. "It's not something I can explain," she murmured. "It's just, they understand me in a way I've never felt before. It's not about what you can or can't give me, Andrew. It's about connection." "Connection," he repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "With 20 stray dogs." "They're not stray," she snapped, her eyes flashing as she finally looked up. They're more than that. They're pulling you away from me," Andrew interrupted, his voice rising. "Do you even realize that? Do you even care?" The sharpness of his words hung in the air. And for a moment, Leah looked as though he'd struck her. But then her expression hardened, her shoulders squaring as she met his gaze. "I do care," she said, her voice steady but laced with hurt. "But I can't keep apologizing for something that feels right. For once in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And if you can't accept that, then," what Andrew demanded, stepping closer. "What does that mean for us, Leah? Are you just going to disappear into the forest and leave me here to wonder what the hell happened to the woman I fell in love with?" Her breath hitched, and she took a step back, the wall of the cabin pressing against her shoulders. "I don't want to hurt you," she whispered. "But I can't ignore what I'm feeling. I can't ignore them." Andrew's hands fell to his sides, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. "And what about me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Do I even matter to you anymore?" Leah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move closer. "You matter," she said, her voice trembling. "You always will. But I don't know how to explain what's happening to me, Andrew. I don't know how to make you understand." He stared at her for a long moment, his chest tightening with the weight of her words. He wanted to argue, to plead, to do anything that might bring her back to him. But the look in her eyes, the quiet certainty, the pull of something he couldn't compete with, told him that no words could change what she felt. "I don't think you can," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "And that's what scares me the most." The room fell silent once more, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. Leah stayed where she was, her arms wrapped around herself, while Andrew turned away, his hands braced against the table as he fought to steady his breathing. The following days passed in strained silence, each moment heavy with the things they couldn't say. Andrew tried to hold on, to remind Leah of the life they'd shared before the cabin, before the dogs. But every attempt felt like grasping at smoke, his words slipping through her fingers as she drifted further into the forest. One night Andrew stood by the window, watching as Leah disappeared into the trees once again. She hadn't even said goodbye this time, her movements hurried, as if the pull of the clearing was too strong to resist. His fists clenched at his sides, his chest tight with a mixture of anger and despair. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered to himself, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't keep losing her piece by piece." But even as he said the words, he knew the truth: she was already gone. The bond they had shared, the love that had once burned so brightly between them, had dimmed under the weight of something neither of them could control. And as Andrew stood there, the firelight casting long shadows across the room, he realized that he was powerless to bring her back. Andrew's cough started as a faint annoyance, a dry rasp that he chalked up to the cold forest air and his restless nights. He barely noticed it at first, too preoccupied with the growing chasm between him and Leah. But as the days passed, the cough deepened, the sound rattling in his chest, lingering like an unwelcome guest. It wasn't just the cough, though. A creeping fatigue settled into his body, leaving him drained and sluggish, as though the energy was being pulled out of him with every breath. He didn't tell Leah. How could he? She was already so far away, her focus consumed by the dogs, her time spent in the clearing while he sat alone in the cabin. The few moments they did share were strained, filled with silences that were heavier than words. Andrew didn't want to burden her with his growing illness, didn't want to give her another reason to drift further from him. So he swallowed the discomfort, hid the shivers that racked his body, and told himself it would pass. But it didn't. One morning, As he tried to haul himself out of bed, his legs gave out beneath him. The runes spun, the edges of his vision darkening, and he collapsed onto the floor with a groan. Sweat slicked his skin despite the chill in the air, and his breath came in shallow, labored gasps. He stayed there for what felt like hours, the wooden planks cold against his cheek, before summoning the strength to crawl back into bed. When Leah returned that evening, she found him still lying there, his face pale and drawn. For a moment, her eyes widened in shock, a flicker of concern breaking through the distance that had settled between them. "Andrew," she said, her voice softer than it had been in weeks. "What's wrong?" He forced a weak smile, trying to sit up but failing as a wave of dizziness washed over him. "Just feeling a little under the weather," he murmured, his voice hoarse. She knelt beside the bed, her hand brushing against his forehead. Her touch was cool, gentle, and for a moment he closed his eyes, leaning into the warmth of her presence. It felt like a lifeline, like the Leah he had fallen in love with was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of distance and change. "You're burning up," she said, her brow furrowing. "How long have you been like this?" "A couple of days," he admitted, his words slurring as exhaustion tugged at him. "It's nothing. Just need some rest." "It's not nothing," she said firmly, her fingers lingering on his wrist as though she could anchor him to her. "You should have told me." "And what would you have done?" he asked, his voice bitter despite himself. "You've been so busy with them." "I didn't want to interrupt." Her face tightened, guilt flashing in her eyes, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stood, fetching a damp cloth from the kitchen and placing it gently on his forehead. The coolness soothed him, and for a brief moment the tension between them seemed to ease, replaced by something softer, more familiar. For the next few days, Leah stayed by his side, tending to him as best she could. She brought him water, coaxed him to eat, and sat with him through the long, restless nights when his fever spiked and his breathing grew labored. Andrew felt a flicker of hope, a fragile thread of connection rekindling between them. But even as she cared for him, he could see the longing in her eyes when she glanced toward the window, the way her hands twitched as though she were itching to leave. It wasn't long before the pull of the forest became too strong to resist. One morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin, Leah slipped out quietly, her footsteps soft on the creaking floorboards. Andrew stirred, his fever-clouded mind barely registering her absence, but when he woke fully and found her gone, the ache in his chest deepened. He tried to convince himself that she would come back soon, that she just needed a moment to herself. But as the hours stretched on and the sun sank lower in the sky, his hope began to waver. The cabin felt colder without her, the walls closing in around him as his illness tightened its grip. By the time she returned, the sky was painted with deep oranges and purples, the first stars beginning to peek through the darkness. She stepped inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes bright with the energy she always seemed to carry after her time with the dogs. "Andrew," she said, her voice filled with relief as she hurried to his side. "I'm sorry, I lost track of time." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as he struggled to summon the energy to speak. When he finally did, his voice was thin, barely more than a whisper. "Did they miss you?" Her smile faltered, her brow creasing in confusion. "What?" "The dogs," he said, turning his head to look at her. "Did they notice you were gone? Or are they always there, waiting for you like nothing else matters?" Leah's breath caught, her hands tightening around the edge of the blanket. "Andrew, that's not fair." "Isn't it?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Because it feels like they're the only thing you care about anymore." "That's not true," she said, her voice breaking. "I care about you. I'm here, aren't I?" Sometimes he murmured, his eyelids heavy. "But it's not the same, Leah. You're here, but you're not here. You're with them." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his, and he felt the faintest spark of the love they had once shared. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't filled with anger or resentment. It was filled with something raw, something fragile. "I don't want to lose you," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "You already have," he whispered, his eyes closing as exhaustion claimed him once more. The days that followed were a blur of fevered dreams and quiet moments, the line between reality and memory blurring in Andrew's mind. Leah stayed with him as much as she could, but each time she left for the clearing, the emptiness in the cabin grew more suffocating. Andrew's strength waned, his body growing weaker with each passing day. He could feel it now, the inevitability of his decline, the weight of something he couldn't fight. And as much as he wanted to cling to the life they had once shared, he knew it was slipping through his fingers. One night, as the firelight danced across the walls, Andrew looked at Leah, who sat beside him, her head bowed as she rested her hand on his. She looked so torn, so lost, and he wished he could ease the burden she carried. Leah, he said softly, his voice rasping. She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You don't have to stay. Her lips parted in protest, but he shook his head weakly. I know where you want to be. I can see it, and it's okay. It's not okay, she said, her voice cracking. I don't want to leave you. You already have, he said, his tone gentle. And maybe that's where you're meant to be, with them. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she leaned closer, pressing her forehead to his. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I know, he murmured. I know. As the night wore on, Andrew drifted into a restless sleep, his breaths shallow and uneven. Leah stayed by his side, her hand never leaving his, even as the first light of dawn began to creep into the cabin. When he finally fell silent, the room felt impossibly still, the fire reduced to embers that glowed faintly in the hearth. Leah sat there for hours, her hands still curled around his, her tears falling silently as the weight of his absence settled over her. And when she finally rose, her movements slow and deliberate, she knew where she had to go. The forest called to her, and the dogs were waiting. The morning after Andrew's final breath, the cabin was impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against Leah's chest and made it hard to breathe. The fire had long since gone out, leaving only cold ashes in the hearth. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she traced the creases in the blanket that still carried the faint warmth of his body. His face was peaceful, almost serene, a stark contrast to the agony she had watched him endure in his final days. But his stillness was unbearable, a weight she couldn't carry. Leah's tears fell silently, one after another, soaking into the fabric of her shirt as she sat there, unable to move. She had known this moment was coming, had seen the inevitability of his decline, but nothing could have prepared her for the crushing emptiness that followed. She reached for his hand, cold and lifeless now, and held it tightly, as if she could somehow anchor herself to him, to the life they had shared, to the person she had been before everything began to unravel. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling under the weight of her grief. I'm so sorry. But the words felt hollow. What could she apologize for? That she hadn't been enough. That she had let herself drift away, carried by forces she couldn't control. That she had found something in the forest, in the dogs, that had filled a part of her she hadn't realized was empty. None of it felt like enough to explain why she hadn't been fully there for him, why her love hadn't been enough to keep him tethered to this world. The dogs were outside. She could feel their presence even now, a quiet hum at the edge of her awareness, like the faint pull of the tide. They were waiting, as they always were, their patience infinite and unyielding. Leah wiped her face with trembling hands, her gaze flicking to the window. The clearing called to her, a soft, insistent whisper that she couldn't ignore. She stood slowly, her legs shaking beneath her as she made her way to the door. Her movements were deliberate, every step heavy with the weight of her decision. She paused at the threshold, glancing back at Andrew's still form, her heart clenching painfully. She wanted to stay, to hold on to him for just a little longer, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. He was gone, and nothing could bring him back. The forest greeted her like an old friend, its stillness a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. The dogs were waiting at the edge of the clearing, their shapes barely visible in the soft morning light. Shadow stood at the front, his amber eyes watching her with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The others flanked him, their postures calm but expectant, as though they had known this moment was coming all along. Leah approached slowly, her steps uneven, her breath catching as the dogs moved toward her. Shadow pressed his massive head against her side, his fur warm against her cold skin, and she felt a flicker of comfort, a faint reminder that she wasn't alone. The others surrounded her, their bodies forming a protective circle, their presence grounding her in a way that words never could. She knelt in the grass, her hands trembling as they buried themselves in Shadow's thick fur. The tears came again, harder this time, her body shaking with the force of her grief. The dogs stayed with her, their silence offering a solace she hadn't realized she needed. They didn't ask for explanations or demand anything of her, they simply stayed, their quiet understanding wrapping around her like a cocoon. I don't know what to do, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to go on without him. Shadow let out a low, rumbling sound, his head resting on her shoulder, and Leah felt a warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the cold that had settled there. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. Hours passed as Leah sat in the clearing, her body curled against Shadow's side, the other dogs pressing close. The sun rose higher in the sky, its light filtering through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. She didn't move, didn't speak, her mind caught in a storm of memories and emotions. She thought of Andrew's laughter, the way he used to hum under his breath when he cooked breakfast, The way he had looked at her when they first found the cabin, hopeful, full of love. She thought of his final days, the way his illness had hollowed him out, leaving behind a fragile shell of the man she had loved. And she thought of the dogs, of the way they had come into her life like a force of nature, changing everything she thought she knew about herself, about love, about belonging. They were a part of her now, as much as Andrew had been, and she couldn't imagine a life without them. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Leah rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked back toward the cabin, the faint outline of its roof visible through the trees, and felt a pang of guilt and sadness. It was a place full of memories, of love and loss, but it no longer felt like home. Shadow nudged her hand, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver through her. The others waited, their gazes steady, their presence a quiet reassurance. Leah took a deep breath, her fingers tangling in Shadow's fur as she made her decision. "I can't stay here," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Not without him." The dogs seemed to understand, their postures shifting as they turned toward the deeper woods, their movements fluid and deliberate. Shadow stayed by her side, his presence a steady anchor as Leah took her first step away from the cabin, away from the life she had known. The forest closed around them, its shadows deepening as the sun sank lower, and Leah felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. They walked for hours, the dogs leading her through the trees, their path winding and hidden. Leah didn't question where they were going, she trusted them, trusted the connection she felt with them, trusted the quiet pull that had brought her here in the first place. The forest grew denser, its silence deeper, until they emerged into a hidden glade bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. It was beautiful, untouched by humanity, a place that felt like it had existed forever, waiting for her. The dogs spread out, their bodies blending seamlessly with the landscape, their movements graceful and unhurried. Leah stood in the center of the glade, her heart aching with a mix of grief and acceptance, and knew she had found her place. As the night fell, the stars beginning to shimmer above, Leah sank to the ground, her back resting against Shadow's side. The other dogs settled around her, their warmth a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. She closed her eyes, the sounds of the forest wrapping around her, and let herself drift, the weight of her loss finally giving way to the quiet promise of something new. The forest had become her world, a vast and unknowable expanse that stretched far beyond the limits of her imagination. Leah moved through it like a ghost, her footsteps soft against the mossy ground, her senses sharper than they had ever been. The air was cool, laced with the rich scent of pine and earth, and the canopy above her dappled the ground in shifting patches of light and shadow. It was a world untouched by time, a place where the echoes of her old life faded into whispers carried away by the wind. The 20 dogs were her constant companions, their presence as natural to her now as the air she breathed. They moved with her through the trees, silent and graceful, their bodies weaving between the trunks like shadows come to life. Each of them had carved a place in her heart, their personalities as vivid and distinct as any human she had ever known. Shadow, ever the leader, walked by her side, his massive frame steady and grounding. Sunny brought a spark of warmth to the group, his playful nature a balm to her grief. Mist, with her piercing blue eyes, watched over them all with a quiet intensity, her loyalty unshakable. Leah had left the cabin behind weeks ago, or perhaps months. Time had become meaningless in the forest, the days blending into one another in a seamless rhythm of light and dark, movement and stillness. She had buried Andrew near the cabin, marking his grave with a simple stack of stones and a branch carved with his initials. The act had been both painful and freeing, a final goodbye to the life they had shared, and the beginning of something new. The dogs had led her deeper into the woods after that, guiding her to places she could never have found on her own. Hidden glades where wildflowers bloomed in impossible colors. Streams so clear they mirrored the sky above. Ancient trees whose roots twisted together in intricate patterns, forming natural arches that felt like gateways to another world. It was as if the forest itself were alive, revealing its secrets to her one by one, welcoming her into its embrace. At first, Leah had struggled to adapt. The comforts of her old life, warm beds, hot meals, the hum of electricity were distant memories, replaced by the raw, untamed beauty of the wild. She learned to survive by watching the dogs, following their lead as they hunted and scavenged, teaching her how to find food and water, how to read the subtle signs of the forest. Her body grew stronger, her movements more fluid, until she felt like a part of the forest rather than an outsider passing through. Her grief for Andrew lingered, a quiet ache that flared in unexpected moments, a particular shade of light filtering through the trees, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, a memory of his laughter echoing in her mind. But it was no longer a sharp, all-consuming pain. It had softened, becoming a part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. The dogs seemed to sense it, their presence a constant reassurance that she wasn't alone, even in her darkest moments. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Leah found herself standing on the edge of a vast meadow. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, the air alive with the hum of insects, and the distant call of birds settling in for the night. The dogs spread out around her, their bodies blending seamlessly with the landscape, their movements unhurried. Shadow pressed against her side, his warmth a steadying presence as she gazed out at the meadow. Leah reached down, her fingers tangling in his thick fur, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was a moment of stillness, of peace, the kind she had rarely experienced in her old life. For the first time in what felt like forever, she spoke aloud, her voice soft but steady. "I don't know why you chose me," she said, her words carried away by the wind. "But I'm grateful." Shadow tilted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver through her. It was as if he understood, as if he could see straight into her soul, peeling back the layers of doubt and fear to reveal something stronger, something unbreakable. The other dogs began to settle around her, their bodies forming a loose circle as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. Leah sat down in the grass, her legs folding beneath her, and let herself lean into Shadow's side. The warmth of the dogs surrounded her, their presence as much a part of her now as her own heartbeat. She closed her eyes, the sounds of the forest wrapping around her like a lullaby, and let herself drift. The night was alive with stars when she opened her eyes again, their light spilling across the sky in a brilliant cascade. She stared up at them, her breath catching in her chest at their beauty. It was a reminder of the vastness of the universe, of how small she was in the grand scheme of things. And yet, in that moment, she didn't feel insignificant. She felt connected, as though the stars were as much a part of her as the forest, as the dogs, as Andrew. She thought of him often, his face a constant presence in her mind. She wondered if he would understand the choice she had made, if he would forgive her for leaving him behind, for finding a new kind of love and purpose in the wake of his loss. She liked to think he would. Andrew had always seen the best in her, even when she couldn't see it herself. The dogs stirred around her, their movements subtle but purposeful, and Leah felt a quiet certainty settle over her. This was her life now, not a life of ease or comfort, but one of raw, unfiltered connection. To the forest, to the dogs, to herself. It was a life she hadn't chosen, but one she had embraced, and for the first time in a long time she felt at peace. As the night deepened, Leah lay back in the grass, the stars above her and the dogs around her. She closed her eyes, her breath evening out as sleep claimed her. The forest held her, the dogs her ever-watchful guardians, and in that moment she was no longer the woman she had been. She was something new, something wild and free, a part of the untamed world she now called home,